Hello out there! Welcome everybody to another edition of our AutoCrit Live. Today we're going to talk about how to fix broken dialogue. And I have Gareth here in his doctor outfit as normal for these sort of
Hello.
discussions. And we do have people visiting or watching, excuse me, from all over Hawaii, Florida, Massachusetts, Washington. Great to hear from you. And as we progress through this discussion, please give us your comments. Are you struggling with I'm struggling. Are you struggling with any scenes of dialogue in your works right now? Anything that comes up? Any tips or tricks that you like to share on how to make your dialogue better? Before we get into that, we should probably stress that dialogue itself is very important. Wouldn't you say so, Gareth?
Yes, extremely important.
And particularly, I mean, this may just be me. Well, actually, I know it's not just me, but something that I tend to do if it's an author I don't know about is I will sometimes just skip ahead to dialogue and I'll see because I tend to really like dialogue. And if I get into the dialogue, I'm like, oh, I like how they're portraying the interactions between the characters. That seems really working for me. That often helps a lot, especially if it's somebody I'm not that familiar with. And I don't think that's unheard of. Do you ever do that, Gareth? Do you ever skip to dialogue or anything like that?
Personally, not so much. When I'm reading for kind of pleasure, I like to just jump in from the beginning or see how things go. Although I do know um, these kind of preliminary checks quite often is jumping to dialogue for a lot of editors. That when it comes to checking submissions,
Right.
same thing for some agents and things like that. When you submit to them, you're looking for representation. They may, with the sample that you send them, just jump straight to looking at a piece of dialogue to see whether that is up to snuff.
Yeah, exactly. We already have a question. Somebody's curious about dialogue written into a paragraph. We'll talk about that. The hidden dialogue, sometimes it's called, or not using dialogue tags, using other things. Yep, and why to do that? But let's. We have a few different tips. This is not going to be in any specific order, although I will stress the importance of the first point here. Hold on, see if I can get it up, and that is avoid expositional dialogue or info dumps. This is generally, if you want to talk about the biggest place where dialogue can go awry, it's where the dialogue itself serves one function and it's just to give information to the audience. I think what happens is a lot of authors will be told, hey, you know what? Show, don't tell, make sure you don't include too much background information. And what they think they're doing and being very clever is instead of putting in the pros and having, John was 6 feet tall and loved his job. Instead, what happens is he goes to work and somebody says, hello, John. It's amazing how your 6 foot tall stature always bounces into work, or something really awkward. And they think that they've gotten away with something. And they really haven't. This sort of information dumping dialogue, which is not really dialogue at all. This is like just, statements. It's just verbal statements. Yeah, this is best to avoid it. Gareth, what do you say about exposition?
Yeah, quite right. the Really, it's just keeping in your mind that dialogue isn't there to be a substitute for narrative exposition.
Right.
It's not just there as an alternative way to give this information across, as kind of plainly and as bland as you can.
Right.
And really, kind of tip here for fixing it, because that tends to be, especially in early days when you're starting to find, figure out how to write and putting your first stories together and all of that. It's really easy. The first lot of dialogue that you start writing will most likely be like this, just purely expositional stuff,
Yep.
with characters forwarding the plot by talking to one another. The real next step to making that better, from my perspective anyway, is connecting it to character. So we have to see in what they're saying what it tells us about that character. And if there isn't that kind of meaning built into it, well, then it's probably expositional. If you can ask
Right.
yourself, am I simply taking information that I could write in the narrative prose and putting it in a character's mouth? If that's the only function that it's performing, it's not very good dialogue. A good example there, Daniel said, what if you wanted to get across that this character was particularly tall, but you didn't want to simply say that in the narrative, and you thought, hey, I'll put it into a piece of dialogue. Well, then it's clunky when you have a character who's there and is completely a kind of baseline bland character who just says, oh, ducking under the doors again, Dawn, that kind of thing. Is you can have a character express that information, but tell us something about that character. So maybe they say it to him in a way that's really cheeky, or they're, very much trying to be offensive or something when they say that to him. That tells us about that character. And the moment they say it, tells us about their personality. So you're using both sides of that coin there to actually make the dialogue pop a little more, be a little better.
Right. And when the biggest thing that will really stand out, in my opinion, is where there's two ways. One is that it just feels like the author is forcing it, and that the person really wouldn't express that information out loud. The classic example of this is in the Muppet Caper, where the character just starts saying all this stuff, and then Miss Piggy's like, "Why are you telling me all this?" And she's like, "Well, it's plot exposition. It has to go somewhere," because they're making fun of that. But that's exactly what you don't want your dialogue to sound like. Like somebody's just sharing information that there would be no particular reason for them to share. But then the other problem that I see also is characters sharing information that the other character already knows. And that's the, as you know, dialogue, which again just tends to be, it's not information that we as the audience know, but there's no reason why somebody would say it. So it comes across really clunky, and that can be awkward even when it's not, necessarily poorly written. It just feels strange. It's like, why are they even talking about that? But we're going to get into ways to kind of fix this a little bit more. Gareth already touched onto it. Another thing that comes up a lot is too much agreement. And too much agreement, again, almost implies that it's not really dialogue. When you think of dialogue, like true dialogue, I think of, different people having a conversation, and it's adding up to something. If the two characters are in full agreement, well, the question is why they wouldn't even need to discuss this in the first place. It could be that they just do need, in order to get on the same page, that they would have been in the first place. But you can see how that's not particularly compelling. Is that even something that's earning its spot on the page? The time that you go to your spouse and you're like, let's go to that restaurant we really like. And she's like, yep. That's not necessarily going to be a compelling conversation to move the plot forward or really reveal much about character, except if you particularly want to show that characters are in agreement. So I'm not saying you can never have agreement, but too much agreement happens. And I think this happens when writers are maybe concerned about getting into the weeds in a conversation or something like that. But what you end up having is this kind of clunky, let's do this. Okay, that sounds good. All right, let's go forward. And it just doesn't really earn its spot at all. Gareth?
So yeah, I agree. Good idea.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, okay, cool. But like,
Yeah.
as we often talk about, conflict is interesting, right? And it can even be the slightest bit of disagreement, right? So somebody says, wow, that's a beautiful dress. And they're like, oh, really? This old thing? That's a bit of a disagreement. It's not like they're going to come to blows. But again, it shows you a little bit something about the character. The character's trying to give them a compliment. They're kind of deflecting it, maybe making a self-deprecating sort of statement. It's just moving the conversation forward in a much better way. And of course, you can, level up the disagreement and, oh, that's a beautiful dress. How come you never noticed it before? Oh, that's a beautiful dress. Well, I'd have more beautiful dresses if you ever bought me anything, and not every conversation has to become a big old fight. But you can see how even the slightest bit of disagreement can just start to tell you something, start to move things forward.
Yeah, I think it's good to reiterate the idea, too much agreement, because
yes,
like Daniel said, there is nothing to say that, of course, at time, that the entire way through your book, people should be disagreeing in some way every single time they talk. No, not necessary.
That would get tiresome in a different way, right?
Yeah, entirely. But I guess another way you can sort of get around this as well, and we will touch on this a little later too, is with body language. So
Yes.
you don't have characters just saying, what are they going to do? And the other person is like, good plan, I agree. That kind of thing. Is just have them nod.
Right. Exactly. And again, if the conversation was going to begin and end with the two characters in agreement, it's kind of like, why are you having it? It's like a whole scene where nothing really happened, right? If it starts to get back to the first point, maybe the only reason you have that scene is to show us that they wanted to carry out a plan, but maybe we didn't even need to see that. Maybe you can just jump to the plan.
Very good
Think
point.
about
Yeah.
it.
If throughout that scene and all of this that's been talked about, nothing has functionally changed,
No.
well, then what's the point?
Right. Yeah. Why even have it? Okay. All right. Let's move forward. Reduce each line to motivation is a good way to reducing each line to motivation is a good way to earn their spots on the page, right? So what you want to do is you want to think about Gareth had a good point, right? With the person coming in who's really tall, and they're all like, oh, ducking under the doors again. Essentially, you could argue the motivating statement of that is mockery, right? So they're not just saying it to convey information to the audience that the person is tall. They're actually mocking the character, right? And if you kind of think of it that way, think of it as if you were like a director, right? And the actress, like, well, what's my motivation? What is going on in the character's head that is motivating them to say it, right? And what you don't want is, well, they're saying it because it's information that needs to go out there, right? Or there's a mechanical function. No, what emotionally, what is going on? And it might actually make you completely rephrase that the way that they say something, because depending on what we're motivated by in that moment, you can describe the most basic of tasks in many different ways. And if you can get that across on the page, then that means the dialogue is doing two things at once. It's not only telling you whatever information the character wants to get out, but it's telling you their emotional state, which can be very helpful. Gareth?
Yeah, going back to those, what I said earlier about that kind of early days of writing too, and finding this, keeping this particular tip in mind is something really great for when you read through early stories and early drafts. And
Yeah.
maybe you're going for a full novel length, and you're finding that the dialogue throughout seems kind of bland. It may actually be that is sprouting from underdeveloped characters who aren't actually all that different,
Right.
and that's why they sound the same.
Right.
Really digging into the motivation behind why, kind of why each character is present in this scene and why they're actually discussing the thing that's happening, is gives you an ability to introduce a little bit of conflict that starts to arise there, because it's worth understanding that every single character has their own kind of specific motivations for actually being involved in all of this. Yes, your hero has their own, and the people with them, or the people next to them, even like their sidekick, if you consider that kind of character, may have the same kind of broader overarching goal. We need to solve this problem, or we need to take down this villain, but they will have their own separate motivations that trickle down from that. Perhaps it's
Right.
protecting a certain family member and things like that. And they're going to be concerned about those motivations. So
Mhm.
they will play into the conversations. If the conversation and the plan starts to focus way too much on solely the motivations of the hero, well, then naturally this other person is going to say, wait a minute, I need to be assured that my motivations are also going to be taken care
Right.
of. And when you really start to think about that, again, the characters grow around that for you, and that kind of bleeds into the dialogue. So think about that. It's a really good tip.
Yeah, exactly. This particularly can be helpful, like Gareth saying, in some of those, I want to call them the boring scenes. But sometimes there are scenes that serve a mechanical function. They're like the business conference room scene, right? Where a bunch of characters have to kind of establish a plan. They have to, or have a long conversation about what they're doing. But again, keeping motivations in mind can be very helpful, because how it is in a business meeting, right? There's certainly the business at hand, but there's all kinds of motivations going on. Sometimes people want to elevate their status within the company. Sometimes people just want the meeting to be over as fast as possible. There are so many different things that can be going on under the surface, and it'll affect the way they talk about it. And if you think about it as you're writing it, or this is really more of a rewriting thing, you can dramatically affect a scene to go from being something that just seems so mechanical to something that really becomes vibrant. And again, it tells you more about the characters. But I will say this is something that is not something I would expect you to do on your first pass. And a lot of these suggestions are not. If your dialogue is poor or bland on your first pass, that's okay. It's serving its mechanical function. This is the kind of stuff you generally tackle on a rewrite. So just wanted to get that out there so you don't panic yourself.
I was thinking that when you said as well, corporate meetings, it's one person's motivation, like, don't snore out loud.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And that's all it, or I don't want to look foolish, right? It could be that, or they're very guarded or who knows what, there's usually more going on. Okay. Cut out overemphasis. And this gets into your word choice and things like that. Do not overdo it, overcook it. And this can come in many different ways. Sometimes it can come out because you're kind of treading water and you just kind of go on. And then the other way that can happen is in your dialogue tags and things like that. So you can have, I really hate you, the man said super angrily, and you're like, yeah, I get that. Like you don't need the super angrily. So this is something that Gareth likes to tackle.
Yeah, I love wading through these with a machete, so to speak, because it has a good knock-on effect. Again, going into the whole show don't tell kind of rules, things that we'd like to follow. There's no need. If somebody jumps in and says, "I got the job," she exclaimed joyfully. Like we get it. We don't need the joyfully, cut the adverb. You can maybe keep exclaimed, but somebody comes into the room and shouts, "I got the job." They're happy. We know they're happy. We don't need to emphasize that. Show it, don't tell it. Let the reader kind of infer. We know. And when you're going through and fixing up your dialogue, if things just feel a little flat in that regard, this can sometimes be the problem. It doesn't read well because you're overemphasizing rather than underemphasizing. It's just too much. You're being too much. And when you dial it back, it can help you see points where when it's dialed back a little, it still doesn't quite land. It means you just need to do more setup in the scene. You give us more context, have a little more action to make sure that the verbal exclamation lands correctly.
Right. I do like this comment. You need to think about your life choices if the dialogue starts with "as you know." It's funny because once somebody points that out to you, because it's not like it's never done. You will see it in all kinds of things. You'll see it in movies and stuff. And every time it happens, you're like, this is really funny. Like, I can't believe they're gonna go away with that, because people still do it. But yes, it is not generally a good idea. That gets back to the point of, why are people saying things that somebody else already knows? And again, that can almost go to the overemphasis. Sometimes that sort of stuff is like, you're just repeating something that the character already knows, and maybe even the audience already knows, and it's not working. Not working at all.
It's like it goes without saying.
It goes without saying. Somebody said if they were writing this that we were agreeing far too much. This is why fiction should not completely reflect reality. I love that. All right, let's move forward. Have people talk in questions. This is a fun little trick. You'll notice if you ever watch improv, this happens quite a lot. It's because talking in a question naturally moves a conversation forward. How are you doing? How should I be feeling? And that's kind of evasive, and then it moves the conversation forward because now they have to answer the question. And even the slightest little questions, it can come up an awful lot in dialogue, more than you might think. You can get away with a lot of this. Let me give you an example. So this is a page from Back to the Future, which is an excellent script, by the way, to study for dialogue. It's excellent from a character perspective and all the exposition they have to dump out and just so many different things. It's great to study. But anyway, here's a sample page, and look, boom, those are all question marks. Yes, this was written with a lot of questions. The scene, it's just one question after the other. And you can see these questions are pretty subtle. How about letting me read one of them? I never let anybody read them. How come? What if they say it's not good? What if they do this? What if they, it's speculation. So it's not necessarily this, it's not only a question to the other character, it's just a question to the universe, and it just keeps it going. It moves it really well. It's a little trick. Once you know it, it can really help bail you out of a lot of trouble. It's a nice little handy dandy trick. You ever use that, Gareth?
It very much lifts the dialogue or kind of speech of the characters into the realm of drama. It takes it into a dramatic place, which is good. It helps to bring it into that middle ground, because obviously you don't want melodrama, which is way too much, or way too plain and, again, too realistic. I think realistic is good, but you can get too realistic. For example, asking questions back and forth or answering somebody's questions with questions in real life is probably going to get both of you quite annoyed very, very quickly. But it works in drama. And the kind of the reason for that is that questions, when they're being asked like that in the context of something we're involving ourselves in as a third party, whether it's reading or watching movies, and invested in a story, has a kind of built-in sense of momentum. We're always, and something that is psychologically a factor called open loops. We're sitting there, we want an answer. And all these questions every time a question is asked, there's an open end there that hasn't been closed. And we're always waiting for the next bit of dialogue or the next entry to give us the answer to that. But then when another question arises, we also want the answer to that. And we're kind of being dragged along the whole way. It's quite subtle, but it works very well indeed. And it can help to bump up dialogue quite a lot.
Somebody said, so interrogations are good. I would say not exactly. Be careful, because what we're suggesting is not for one character to ask a bunch of questions and the other character to answer them. That can feel like heavy-handed way of getting information out, right? It's not like it's never done, but it feels almost a little easy to be like, oh, I want the audience to know all these details about the character, so I'm just going to start the book with a job interview, and this person's going to ask a bunch of questions, this person's going to answer. What we're talking about is actually when you build questions on questions can actually keep the momentum going. So, for example, in the job interview, they're like, why do you want this job? And they could say, whatever the reason is, and they could be like, well, are you always this friendly? And that's a question. It's kind of combative, and just phrasing it that way can keep it going, if that makes sense. Maybe Gareth has a better example.
Although I take that in a different direction of, so interrogations are good, is not so much in the sense of, like Daniel said, characters are constantly interrogating the other one, which is question, answer, question, answer, question,
right?
Like feeling like the other character is being put on the spot. Not so much. However, in the sense, if you think to interrogation scenes of actual real interrogations happening in various media, some of the most involving conversations take place in a setting like that, precisely because of lots of questions. And that's usually when questions are being fired both ways.
Yes.
Because there's different things you can do with that. Is let's say the person in the position of power, like it's the detective or somebody, is talking to the person who's chained to the desk, and every question they ask them, trying to get information out of them, that prisoner is responding with another question.
Right.
But what are you burying in those questions that are being asked back to the detective? Is it questions that make you question kind of who's interrogating who here? That the villain or the prisoner is trying to extract information from the detective, or are they phrasing questions in the sense of they're trying to clue the detective in on that they know more and have access more about that detective than the detective thinks? It becomes very dramatic in that sense, but it's based on what you bury inside those questions. It's all subtextual. They're talking around what they're actually talking about, which is a really great marker of excellent dialogue.
Yep. And the other thing too is, don't forget, like the Back to the Future example, it wasn't just information from the other person that they don't have an explanation. There were some questions like to the universe itself. I think of, when you think of interrogation scenes, I think of like The Dark Knight, with the Joker, who's constantly asking them questions that are of a philosophical nature, because he's very anarchist, for lack of a better word, and deconstructive of so many things. And so he's challenging them by asking them questions while they're asking him questions. And it just makes for really riveting scenes, because he's not specifically asking them questions so much about themselves as much as their view on the world, and asking questions almost of the universe itself. So there's lots of different ways you can do questions. It's a lot of it is just the way they're framing, the way they're talking.
Yeah, and I think as well, the super famous too dialogue exchanges between Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling.
Same thing. Yeah.
Perfect thing of it, it's set up a little differently, so it's not just rapid fire questions back and forth. So, for example, she'll be asking him questions. He will talk a little, but bury a question in it and expect an answer from her. And when she answers, he verbally processes that answer a little, finds his way around it, and then punctuates that with another question. Tries to dig deep until it gets to the point of she's been told not to talk to him, so that's built into the kind of tension of all of that, and we can see that he's starting to dig in until they get to a kind of quid pro quo agreement between them. It's like, you answer a question and then I'll answer a question. They're digging into each other really, really deeply, and that's why it's so involving. Although I did notice a few questions there in the comments. And
here's one. What about characters asking questions themselves, questioning their own motives? A character questioning themselves within like prose does happen. It's like, usually in italics, it's their thinking. Yeah, that can be an effective thing to do. It can be overused, but I've seen it used effectively for sure. And even in dialogue, that sometimes is essentially that's what happened in the Back to the Future. He's like, well, what if they don't like it? What if this? That's essentially a character asking a question of themselves. Did you have another question you want to specifically, or another comment you want to bring up? I have other ones.
I did notice, one that caught my eye there. But then again, too many questions in a string sometimes find that's too much. Should you break them up? Yes. You don't want to just constantly, this is a tip to use in dialogue rather than make all your dialogue questions, because that's going to be an absolute nightmare. Right. But find it for those really good scenes, like that kind of Hannibal and detective-esque setups are really, really good for it, because you can say a lot in a dramatic atmosphere. Right. However, certainly. And if you call back to the Future script example there, Marty and George, so Marty's asking questions, George is answering them. And you'll notice that the writer, about as the dialogue goes on, so that it doesn't become an interrogation, George asks a question back at the end of an answer. So the questioning keeps going, but it's not an interrogation. It's not just I have a question and you answer it.
Yep. You can say a lot with how a character asks a question. That's right. Because there's a difference between asking direct questions, indirect questions, abrasive questions. It says a lot. Somebody said, Stephanie, it's all about how you word the question. Teens have to be asked specific, and there are questions that they will give stealth evasive answers. That's right. Whenever a character asks another character a question and they change the subject or don't talk about it, that tells you something in of itself. So that can be effective just on its own without you having to tell the audience there's some sort of problem. It can clue them into something like that.
Sure. Questions are probing by nature. And quite frankly, in storytelling, this is what you want to be doing. The story itself at the end of the day is about probing into the characters. Like, what's going on in there is what we're trying to drag out. So it's kind of it's pretty much why questions work so well as well.
Right. And to some degree, if you have characters in a scene, kind of like the Back to the Future one, where they're asking casual questions of each other, it's showing a certain amount of bonding. Because if they're not being very evasive, if they're just kind of going with it and asking questions back and forth, it shows the audience without having to be like, "Hey, we're really getting along, aren't we?" It shows that they are starting to bond. They're starting to relate to each other and things like that. Versus more like the Hannibal example, where it's definitely more of a chess match, right? There's a certain amount of I wouldn't call that bonding. It's a very different sort of thing. There may be a certain amount of intellectual, empathy or whatever you want to say, but it's different. It's very different. All right. Let's see. We have here's an interesting question. Just, can you use dialogue to explain a magic system? Well, obviously you can use dialogue to explain just about anything. The challenge is, like we said at the beginning, don't use it as a crutch to be like, well, instead of just putting it in the prose that the way the magic system works is blah, 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 blah. Instead, I'm just going to have the wise old wizard sit down and be like, just so you know, the magic system is blah, 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 blah. That generally doesn't work very well. especially for any length of time. I mean, you'll notice something like Star Wars, for example, when Obi-Wan is to talk about the Force, it's pretty short, it's compact, it gets it out of the way, and then it immediately starts getting into other things, because when he does his first exposition about the Force, you get these weird evasive answers about Luke's father and other things, and so there's other things baked into it than just information about the magic system. And you'll notice he doesn't give you very much information, because in the next scene, he's going to do like the mind trick thing. And he never says that. He's not like, oh, yeah, the Force, it does all these things. You can do this and you can do this and you can do that. Like, because, instead the story allows that to be learned as it's necessary for the scenes.
Yeah, I don't think there's any Luke Force training montage or lectures.
One thing to ask yourself in your dialogue is this the right speaker? You might find that sometimes you need to get information out to the audience, and you're aware of this. It's a mechanical fact. You cannot get rid of it. However, you might have chosen the wrong person to convey the information, because there might be another character that can convey the exact same information in a more interesting way. For example, you might think, oh, well, the main character should talk about this problem because they're the main character. When there's another character who can talk about the same problem, but from the motivation, from an emotional motivation that's going to make it way more compelling to the audience to hear about the problem, right? It's the difference between the main character being like, oh yeah, this kingdom miles away had this horrific fight and wasn't it so terrible, and actually hearing from somebody firsthand, yes, they came in and all of this stuff, it just makes a very big difference. So sometimes if it's not really working, think about it from that standpoint, especially if you have information that just needs to get out there.
Yeah, I think discomfort with some dialogue as well, in terms of, is it working? It's usually what happens. You read through it and you just think, this is just not quite coming together. Can be from this perspective. I think that it's a really good tip. Is this the right speaker? Thinking back to those motivations, but also character archetypes and personalities. Who is this person that you've built? Sometimes you do fall into the trap of simply using them as a mouthpiece, as a utility to say something or deliver a piece of information that maybe is not really in their personality to open up about that right then. But you've chosen to do it, so it can feel off. Always go back to the character.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. I was trying to think of an example because, and I can't off the top of my head, but because I've watched, a lot of commentaries and movies and things like that. And I know I've heard of this example where they're like, we had to get this information to the audience and we just couldn't do it. And then when we gave it to somebody else, it just makes a bigger difference. I mean, one thing too is even there's emotional motivation. There's even things like comedic perspective, right? Well, here's an example, in the Ant-Man movies, where you have Lewis give his little recap of what's going on, and it's really funny, and all it is just a bunch of exposition, but it lands really well, because the way he retells it is so entertaining and silly that you don't really think about the fact that it's basically just one big information dump. So it's a way to get it out of the way. So yeah, so things like that, think of that too. Maybe it's not even that the character you have is wrong, but the other character would just be able to punch it all the more. The way that maybe even the way they talk. Don't give your big moment where a character has to realize something deep and philosophical to a character that generally is not very deep and philosophical, because it won't seem very realistic. And you may end up dialing back how interesting the way they say it is, because you're like, well, they don't use that kind of language. Well, then maybe give it to somebody else. Just think about that. All right. Don't forget diction. Oh, that blends right into what I was talking about. Look at that. Yeah. This is, when I specifically say don't forget diction, it is, don't forget the fact that your characters should sound different from each other, even more so than they probably do in reality. In fact, I would say authors are probably overly concerned with realistic dialogue versus distinct dialogue, in my experience, with editing and helping others out. What often happens is authors will get to some sort of natural way of showing human speech, and then the characters will kind of sound a little samey within that sphere. And that's not necessarily the end of the world, but it robs you of a lot of richness when you do not, push addiction and the way that people phrase things and all of those things, because it can reveal a lot and it can make the dialogue a lot more creative.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cut out the small talk, and but sometimes, kind of like we said earlier, sometimes small talk does need to be there, or it feels more natural having it there for a moment.
Yeah.
However, you can really pep up small talk to keep people differentiated when you don't forget diction. Don't take your eye off the ball in terms of who they are. The main recommendations that I sort of get people to do with figuring this out for characters is think about who they are, everything that's going on in their life. And this is stuff that you, little term, may know but don't show. It's just background info that maybe isn't part of the story, but you know about this character. Stuff like their jobs, their hobbies or interests, how educated are they, where do they come from, where did they grow up, will set a lot of sayings and things that they may, terms of phrasing that they'll use, that they grew up with, that they bring with them into their point in the story. And a lot of that, when you think about it and kind of break it down, helps you build what I could refer to generally as like a verbal toolbox for each of these characters. And that can focus in on one thing. So it can be terminology that's actually related to their job, that transfers into their everyday speech. References that they take from hobbies, again, that transfers in. A lot of the time that'll go into the descriptions that they use, the metaphors that they use as well, because these things make sense to them. That's how they draw very quick parallels or descriptions on how things sound or feel or whatever comes from the things that they have experience with. You can also do it with personality markers as well. Are they generally jovial and
Yep.
make fun of things all the time? Are they super stoic and generally don't
Yep.
react to things?
Yep.
Now, one great thing as well is you'll sometimes have characters who refuse to engage with dramatic construction. They are fans of just being straight up and plain. They want you to talk to them straight. Everybody else to talk to them straight. So they feel like a kind of weird character in a dramatic situation where people are asking questions and talking around things and there's tension. And this one character is there just saying, look, would you just talk to me like a normal person? It can be fun, something to play with, maybe a little bit of a meta element in there to play with. But that's, again, it's not something that you necessarily want to avoid. But you just want to make sure that each character has their own distinct toolbox in that sense. So when you
Yep.
build these things for one character, that character owns them more or less.
Right.
And it easily differentiates from the others when they start speaking. So don't forget that. Certainly, some things in terms of comedic value as well. When you build characters who have this, say they have their own little sayings that are very esoteric from the backwater areas of over here that nobody's
Right.
ever heard before. Don't be too scared of that, because you might think some readers will read that and they won't understand it and therefore it's not going to work. You can have another character say, what on earth is that supposed to mean?
Right.
And
Yeah.
you get a funny
True.
moment.
Yeah. Right. It's true. And I also, to get onto that, I think sometimes people worry about characters being cartoony. And yes, I mean, I understand that to a point. You don't want your character so flat. But on the other hand, if you think about what audiences respond to, they often do respond to strong personalities, and it's not necessarily the end of the world if your character is quite exaggerated. It just depends on the work. If you want to write a story where there's somebody who's just like really sarcastic all the time and they're just really have a really dark, viewpoint of the world, and it's just comedic, it's not necessarily going to bury it as something people are going to read and they'll be like, well, this doesn't resemble real life, because audiences are often willing to go there. It depends on a lot of things. Look at other works in your genre that you're trying, look at the other books that the audience, you think you're going for are reading. But often I think writers are a little bit scared of that. And I'd much rather have to tell a writer, tone it down a little bit. Is there a little bit of nuance you can throw into this character than for everybody to basically feel the same.
Yeah, there's really just nothing worse than going through page after page, and every time
No.
people speak, it just sounds
Right.
completely interchangeable.
Right. I'd much rather it be like, Winnie the Pooh or Charlie Brown or something where it's very exaggerated and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a little maybe not that realistic than what I see a lot of the time. And I honestly think, for the most part, that tends to work more than people think. I think people overestimate the idea of, because I think when people are talking about flat characters, it's really not this sort of, they have a similar way of speaking. It's more of, they don't seem to serve any function beyond a mechanical role in the story. And so I can't really get into them. I can't really understand their motivation. I think that's a lot more to do with it. But that's probably a discussion for another time. All right. Watch out for profanity, slang, and colloquial terms. Gareth, you want to handle this one?
Yeah, I think that kind of naturally bleeds off the previous previous point. These things could be really really great terms, or tools even to use for specific characters. So as you're building that toolbox, you're giving it to them. It can be overdone. Yep. I think it's really just, if you decide to go with these things, again, use them with good measure. It's not that when a character comes from somewhere, kind of like I said previously, and they have their own terms and phrases that they'll use, that they're using that every single time they talk. No, that's not building the kind of character they I think become too much. Like Daniel was saying, you'll start seeing recommendations to dial that back a bit.
Right.
And much the same with profanity as well. For example, a character can stand out by being the one who swears a lot. Like nobody else in the story really likes to swear, but this particular character is foul-mouthed, almost in the extreme. But again, you don't want to overdo it. Like every single sentence, they're effing and blinding. It's just going to make them quite unlikable. Usually, if they're supposed to be an unlikable character, then there you go. Yeah, or annoying, or just boring and off-putting. So just watch out for it. It's all in measure. But like I said, don't worry too much about using things like slang and being worried that readers would totally not understand it and therefore it's not going to work, because you can work in a question from somebody else. And what is that? I mean, I worked with a Dutch company for quite a while, and a lot of their sayings just don't translate to English at all. From Dutch, so they would try to translate it, and then it was like, okay, so what's that supposed to mean? And the story behind it just is in no way attached to the English version of the phrase. Right. And you can work things like that in, and I think it's always a good thing to me when you make a reader laugh. It adds a lot to the experience and connection to the characters. So don't be too scared of it, but watch it. Keep it under control.
Right. Yeah. Profanity, we're seeing lots of different comments about how much to use it. It is quite subjective. I mean, you can certainly point to works that it's just all throughout because it's trying to be this, hard hitting, or, it's portraying a group of people that just tend to swear all the time and they want it to seem realistic. But I've also seen those same groups portrayed without it. And it's not like I don't believe it, because I'm like, yeah, you know what? If this really was, this group of people, they would probably be swearing all the time. I mean, no, because again, this is fiction. So it's often an artistic choice. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't, I'm with Stephen King made a point of this in terms of, how much profanity to use in his book on writing. It's like, it is the important thing is not to make it sound untruthful, right? So you don't want to bring attention to itself. So if you have some hard-knuckled soldier and they stub their toe and they're like, oh, fiddlesticks, it's probably going to sound a little weird, but if for whatever reason you don't want to throw out that much profanity, or you just don't like it, there's other ways of doing it. I just want to throw that out there. I know different people have different opinions about such. And then the audience too, right? Because maybe you're not writing for an audience that, what if you're writing for middle grade, but you want to have a soldier coming home? That doesn't mean all of a sudden, just to be realistic, you have to blow the audience, All right. Watch out for jargon and fictitious words. This is kind of another element of this, right? Watch out for characters using too much inside speak, and particularly your inside speak within your own universe. This can really drive you crazy, but it depends on the genre. There are people that will read fantasy and they love that steep climb, and they have to kind of parse out what people are saying and get the context. And as long as it's all there and they can actually follow along, they're going to throw that much brain power and that much effort to read something. That's not the same thing generally if somebody's sitting down to read a romance or something, because it's just a different audience expectation. But just keep it in mind. You certainly don't want to get to the point that the characters are saying a lot of things that are internal, and there would be no way for the audience to easily tell, or they have to basically feel they have to sit there with a glossary just to follow along with it. That's not usually the best.
Yeah, I would make sure context is inferred easily enough through those things. I mean,
Exactly.
something like a piece of jargon in a sci-fi, if what needs to happen is, we're damaged, we need to get out of here, and we can't. It's like, that's the problem, we need to get out. And then one of the engineers says, reading 90% power to quantum tachyon drive 4, or whatever kind of thing is in there. You understand what they're doing. It's in there. But the jargon works in that case, because we know what the problem is. We know what they're trying to solve. But when it comes to super jargony other stuff, you don't want to just mention it out of context, because that's what confuses people.
Right. Somebody said, can you use basically asterisk for profanity? I believe so. I mean, another way I've seen it done is they say they swore or something like that. Or they yelled and the other character's like, hey, watch your mouth or something. I've seen that too. I think there are different ways of handling it. What do you think about that, Gareth?
From an editorial perspective, I wouldn't like to see asterisks taking out swear words. It's like, if you're going to do that, then do without the swear word.
Okay.
It's go big or go home, kind of on the swearing.
But what do you feel about like the character steps they yelled out in pain, and the other person says, "Hey, watch your mouth"? Is that
great?
kind of
Yeah,
a good
like you could just say they swore under their breath, or swore,
right.
at doing it, and another one says, watch the language,
Yeah.
or without the other person responding, but like swore under their breath.
Yeah,
fine. That's fine. But
Right.
I wouldn't substitute with asterisks.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Somebody mentioned a regional difference. Yes. Depending on what word you use, you can end up with a completely different meaning, for sure. It's like the American expression, or no, it's the British expression. I heard this was somebody saying that they want to knock somebody up just means they want to visit their door, a knock on their door. Whereas in America, that means to impregnate them. So that can create quite a difference depending on what it is. But Gareth could tell me if that's right. I've heard that before.
Which was that one? Sorry.
Like a man could say to a woman, I want to knock you up, which means they want to knock on their door, not impregnate them.
Oh, right. Yeah, getting knocked up. Yeah, that's impregnation.
Right. Is it impregnation in UK as well?
Yeah.
I wonder where it is. It was some area. I thought it was the UK. But again, you could see how that expression could easily be, oh, I want to knock on your door. Or it could mean I want to impregnate you, which is a completely different meaning. And these sort of things can happen. So yeah, that's where editors can be your friend, because they can be like, I'm not sure if you want to put it quite that way. Because somebody from a different region is going to read this quite differently.
I'm just going to catch up with a couple of comments
Sure.
here while we're going. Tommy, I'd like to recommend a couple of books on dialogue, if I may. You may indeed, Tommy. Please do share.
Go ahead.
I think the more good resources and things for people to check out, the better.
Sounds good.
Especially for dialogue. And profanity is like a spicy pepper. Great flavor, but used in moderation. Yeah, of course. Once it becomes way too prevalent, it's exaggerated. And but again, that's a stylistic thing. Maybe you are trying to exaggerate a character in that sense, and it works for the story and it works for the audience. That's the important thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it could be a character you just want to show as very base or whatever, animalistic or something, and so that's the way to get it across.
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird.
And I don't want to sound overly judgy about the way people talk. I'm just talking. Let's keep moving on. Allegorical stories in dialogue. That allegorical stories are a wonderful way of kind of, I'm trying to think of a good way of putting it, but what they can do is they can allow the character to say something in a more artistically interesting way to the audience, and it's all about the subtext. And so what they're going to do is, rather than, it's kind of like the person goes to the mobster, and the mobster's like, there once was a scorpion and it was walking across the desert, and then a man came up and it squished the scorpion on the head. And from the context of what he's talking about, that what he's saying is, hey, if you get out of your territory, I'm gonna kill you. And it could be a really great way of doing that without the big boss guy saying, if you get out of your territory, I'm gonna kill you. But Gareth might be able to speak to this a little bit better because I think he does this.
Yeah, you can twist this all sorts of ways. Allegorical stories, kind of a point here to be is keep them as something in your toolbox to use in the dialogue. Now, the most common example of it would be something like Daniel said there. You have the bad guy or the mob boss. One of the underlings, let's say, has messed up. Something's gone wrong, and they have them in a room, and they're posturing, and instead of just getting straight to the caving their head in or whatever it is they're going to do to punish them for the failure, they all of a sudden launch into a story about their life. But usually when it comes to people like that, it's going to be, or characters like that, they'll talk about a time that a specific lesson was taught to them, usually very harshly, like the day my father found me having done this. And then once they get to the end of that story where the point has been made, that's when they explode in that sort of frenzy of violence and really drive it home. That's how they make a point. That's how they deliver the lesson. And they're merely extending that lesson based on what they learned in life. And this is how they know how to do it. And that kind of goes right back to what we talked about earlier about great dialogue connecting with character. These allegorical stories are coming from that character's experience. They're talking about times in their life. So it tells us about their history. It tells us about what made them and what forged these, well, not just the thought processes, but the actions that they're taking. That's why I really, really love scenes like that and try to use them as often as I can. But of course, it doesn't need to be the mob boss who does that. It can be your main character or somebody that they're with. They're sitting at a diner table and they're having a coffee, and one of them just starts telling a story to the other one, and then you start to realize that built in this story is something honest. They're being truthful about this lesson, and it becomes, you just get sucked right into it. It's a really great way to get a lot in there because it's an ideal combination of again, storytelling, open loops, something that's really pulling you in, and revealing layers of character at the same time.
Yeah. It also can be a great way for stuff that you wouldn't think people would be able to vocalize well out loud. Like, for example, imagine it's somebody who's a bit of a risk taker, a little bit of a not a very safe person, and they're doing, I don't know, maybe they have a gambling addiction or something, and they've reached rock bottom, and they go to a bar and they go to the person like, I often like to go past the speed limit, and this time it just so happens there was a tree in my way or something, you know what I mean? And essentially what they're doing is they're telling an allegorical story, but they're sharing details about their life in a way that they can in that moment, and it can work really well. All right. And on the flip side of that is opposite meanings. So this would be the mob boss that's like, wow, that's a beautiful car you have there. People do this all the time. And what it means is usually the opposite, right? When the mob boss says, oh, that's a beautiful car you have there, what they mean is, when they mean it as a threat, that potentially something bad might happen to it. Bless your heart, in the South is a common one, right? Oh, bless your heart. Usually it means, wow, you're an idiot. But people often will speak like this. So this is something to keep in your toolbox. Realize that sometimes instead of doing something on the nose, instead do the opposite of on the nose, and it could land. Just give it a whirl. Try it out.
Yeah, it's the nice shop you have here. It would be a shame if something happened to it.
Right, exactly. Which, of course, the only reason why somebody would say that is because they think something is going to happen to it, right? Yeah, exactly. I absolutely love sitting at my desk every day drinking this flat coffee, is basically just a reconstruction of them saying every day I sit at the desk drinking my flat coffee, but it's much more interesting to listen to. And it also is more natural. It's more, if somebody's going to say something like that, they'd be more likely to say it in such a way. All right. Try adding a third wheel. We've been talking a lot about this back and forth. One thing that can make dialogue a lot more interesting is by having more characters. I like this. Gareth builds up and force her way to the top. It's true. That's why I stay over here and he stays in his little box.
Oh, I'm a big teddy bear.
That's what he says, but isn't that what a mob boss would want you to think, right?
Watch out for the quiet ones.
Watch
That's
out
what
for the
they
quiet
say.
ones, exactly. Yeah, but what you might find is that third wheel, that other perspective, can make a scene more interesting. Especially a dialogue scene where people are having to figure out a problem. And again, we were talking about motivations earlier. Well, the third person's motivation could be they want the conversation to be over as soon as possible. They want to talk about something else. They have a completely different mindset than the other people. And instead of it just being this tennis match, boop, 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 which isn't the end of the world, but it would be da, 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 and it just changes the rhythm, and it can make it a lot more interesting if you find your scenes kind of flat.
Yeah, I think really fun examples of something like this too that really can pep up a lot of scenes is adding a third wheel person in there who's kind of not involved but puts a kind of pressure on the conversation by the fact they are there.
Right.
For example, two characters having a blazing row or a big argument, or they're really trying to figure something out when they're standing at the front of a queue. In front, let's say it's a DMV worker who's at the desk and they are there and there's people queuing behind them, and the DMV workers is going to have to pipe up at some point and say, can you move? And maybe then the two of them turn around and simultaneously shout, "Shut up," kind of thing. It's like, you're not involved in this.
Yeah.
It just, again, you can use this so many ways to
Yeah.
just add a bit more tension and drama to it.
Yeah, it also works really well if you have a scene where people really do have to have it out, and then there's a third character that doesn't allow them to, or then they have to get super evasive and weird about what they're talking about. Those scenes are great. When there's that third person there that can't know all the information that you're about to discuss, and so you have to talk around the subject, but you still want to get what it is out without them noticing. Like it just
like ixnay on the iced hay.
Yeah, it could just make things so much more interesting. All right, I think that was actually my last point. So that's great. Hopefully you liked all these tips. I'm pretty sure you did because they were great. We had a couple of comments for books. So thank you, Tammy, recommending a few. I have not read these books, so I cannot speak to them, but I'm sure they're good. And then writing dialogue. Sounds good. But I will probably check them out now that you mentioned them.
Yeah, Tom Kyrella's stuff's usually very, very good. And I saw a mention of any that we recommend. Of course, I have to do a little shout out because we all love Rain Hall.
Yes, Rain Hall. Yes,
her little book on writing vivid dialogue.
Yes,
is great from the Writer's Craft series. They're all very small, real easy to digest things, just with very actionable tips in a series to grab. So writing vivid dialogue is a good one.
One character I love dropping into my scenes accidentally turned everything into innuendo. I mean, that could be fun too, right? The third wheel that thinks they know what they're talking about and are dead wrong. And the other characters know they're dead wrong, but they're just not going to clarify it because it's way too interesting for them to not realize what it is. Yeah, that could be a lot of fun. Or they misunderstand. I find that kind of misunderstanding versus being a big mechanical plot thing, which tends to just annoy me. That could be fun. If it's for comedic effect, that's cool. I like that. I will have to look more carefully at characters' dialogue. Always a good idea, for sure. Take another look. And this is a process too, you'll get better as time goes on and you get more practice and things like that. Oh yes, dialogue written within a paragraph. Let's go cover that really quickly. The idea of burying your dialogue. Is there something to look out for when you're doing this, Gareth? What do you think?
Honestly, to me, it's about white space. And just in the name, buried dialogue. Is it buried right in the middle of a gigantic chunk? I would urge you to restructure it and make sure that it's seen more clearly. That's really the only concern for me. I don't have a whole lot of a problem with a bit of action, bit of dialogue, bit of action. You kind of have it sandwiched in there. Yeah, the example, they dashed to the door. Wait, Maria yelled, but John was already there.
Yeah, that seems totally fine.
No problem at all. However, if that comes right in the middle of, a big blocks of text on either side of it, and it's just right there in the middle, you're going to have to do something about it. Break it up.
My editor may not, doesn't allow it. It may be because of the genre you're in, or it could be the specifics of the editor. But I do know there are some genres that don't tend to have it as much as others. It's just not as much of an industry norm. So perhaps your editor is concerned that it's just going to get lost and people will not be able to track it. So
yeah, people's tolerance for it will be will vary up and down. Some editors will just say, no, I absolutely, and that can be for ease of editing as well. They're just like, that's a core rule. I'm going to stick by that. So
Yeah.
I don't have to argue with myself.
Right.
is a
It's
great way to
true.
approach things. So
It's like
your mileage may vary, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. It's like they say in psychology, the 100% rule is easier than the 99% rule. It's just, I never do this. It's easier to do than, well, sometimes. It's easier to maintain that. All right. So next week, we are going to talk about scenes. We're going to kind of do the same thing we did today, but we're going to talk about how to fix a broken scene. So let's say you have a scene and you're wanting to know how to fix it because it's just kind of clunky and not working, but you know it mechanically needs to be there. That is what we're going to talk about next week. And if you're an AutoCrit member, we do have a Q&A with Lisa Gardner, a New York Times bestselling author, and that will be on Friday. So check that out in the community. And if you're not a member, well, join up and then you can be part of the community. And the great thing is it'll give you access to a best-selling author, and we'll take questions from the chat as we can, and it's pretty cool. You don't get access like that all the time.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. These Q&As basically on Zoom, we sit in the room. It's like sitting in the room with the author. You're free to ask questions,
great.
and we just chat. It's all quite casual and get to the kind of meat of their process and how they do things. You're free to pick brains as much as you like. So Lisa Gardner, suspense and thriller author, in on Friday. It's going to be a great chat.
It will be. All right. Well, in the meantime, we will see you around. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell, share this video with your friends, anybody you think would benefit from learning about dialogue, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.